Welcome to another episode of History Now the Future, a show where we take a sharp look at some of the most pressing issues of today, using history as our guide and the future as our destination. My name is Cory Bradford, and the 2024 Democratic National Convention kicks off in Chicago, Illinois this week. The city of Chicago is no stranger to these types of events. In fact, more presidential candidates have been nominated in the city of Chicago than any other U.S. city. But one of the most memorable conventions to take place in Chicago was the 1968 Democratic National Convention. That year, the convention was marred by anti-war protesters who blamed President Lyndon B. Johnson, as well as the Democratic Party in general, for the escalation of violence in the Vietnam War. Now, 56 years later, we are finally getting a sequel to the 1968 DNC. But like most reboots these days, the writers are really just relying on so many storylines from the first version. I mean, we got another convention in Chicago in which an incumbent Democratic president has stepped down and is not seeking another term, and anti-war protesters will be one of the main features of this convention. This time, the protesters are pro-Palestinian protesters who are livid at the way President Joe Biden and the Democrats have handled the Israel-Hamas war. That war started back on October 7th of last year when Hamas attacked Israel, killing thousands and taking several hundred people hostage. Most of those hostages are still being held by Hamas. But Israel's response to this attack has been disproportionate to say the least. Israel has instituted a mass bombing campaign in the region of Gaza that just this past week has resulted in a total of more than 40,000 deaths. Now, those numbers have been released by the Gaza Health Ministry, and they make no distinction between civilian deaths and the deaths of actual members of Hamas. We do know that more than 13,000 of those killed have been children. Israel has been accused of human rights abuses at the very least, and some have even accused them of committing outright genocide. The pro-Palestinian protesters represent a very significant portion of the population when it comes to the Democratic Party. States like Michigan are filled with Arab American voters and Muslim voters who, before all of this, often voted for Democrats. This year, that may change, as the situation in Gaza will be the #1 issue on most of their minds this November. So now the question is this: what is the actual goal of these protesters in Chicago? Their stated goal is to bring about an immediate ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. But another possible effect these protests could have is aiding in costing Democrats votes this year, which means the Dems could lose the Senate and possibly lose the White House. More importantly, this would push Donald Trump back into the White House. And does Donald Trump being in the White House aid in the goal of bringing about an immediate ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war? Maybe it would. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been adamant about continuing this war, considers Trump to be a great ally. And it doesn't seem like the Republicans are all that concerned with the plight of the Palestinians. So why do pro-Palestinian protesters tend to demonstrate against Democrats more so than they do against Republicans? Well, a lot of this has to do with the fact that Joe Biden is the president, and he's a Democrat. The buck has to stop with him, and he has been very steadfast in his support of Israel, even after Israel's bombing campaign escalated to an unacceptable level. Joe Biden actually circumvented Congress to push more weapons to Israel when Congress was stuck on a bill that would have provided more support for them. However, Biden's position did change slightly when it came to the Israel Security Assistance Act. Back in May, House Republicans passed that bill, a bill that specified no federal funds could be withheld, halted, reversed, or canceled when it came to the delivery of defense articles for Israel. This bill came after President Biden paused an arms shipment to Israel because of concern over Israel's invasion of Rafah, a region where many civilians were seeking shelter. Biden didn't want to give Israel more heavy bombs that could lead to higher civilian casualty rates in that region. But Republicans pushed for more weapons to be sent to Israel, even though evidence of human rights abuses in Gaza was mounting. So the blame for America's unabashed support for Israel can go in many different directions. But the Brookings Institute has done some very interesting research on determining how many Democrats support Palestine versus how many Republicans do. Here are some of the numbers from their July report on this matter. When it came to Democratic congressional candidates, 7% of them took a hardline stance against Israel, claiming that Israel is committing genocide and that the U.S. must stop supporting this war. 18% of these Democrats said that the U.S. should support Israel conditionally, and they called for a ceasefire. Another 17% of Democratic candidates said that we should support Israel while also supporting humanitarian aid for Gaza. while 40% of Democratic candidates flat out refused to even talk about this issue. But only 13% of Democrats claimed that the U.S. must unconditionally support Israel in its war against Hamas. Now take a look at those numbers for Republican congressional candidates. Only 3% of Republican candidates said that Israel is committing genocide. Only 1% of Republican candidates have called for a ceasefire. And an additional 1% of Republican candidates said that we should support Israel while also supporting humanitarian aid for Gaza. That means that roughly 5% of Republicans running for congressional office have any stance that could even be remotely considered pro-Palestinian. Meanwhile, 49% of Republicans said that the U.S. must unconditionally support Israel in its war against Hamas. An additional 46% of them have said nothing on this issue. So 95% of Republicans running for Congress either support Israel with no conditions or have been simply silent on this issue, while nearly 40% of Democrats have either called for a ceasefire, supported humanitarian aid for Gaza, or have outright accused Israel of genocide. Now, I'm not trying to absolve the Biden administration for the horrible atrocities that they have enabled Israel to commit against Gaza. But if you're looking at this from a standpoint of which one of these parties is more likely to be in favor of basic human rights for Palestinians, the evidence cannot be clearer. But perhaps this is the reason why pro-Palestinian protesters target Democrats, because they know they can push the Dems to actually bend to their will and call for an arms embargo and a ceasefire. But the Dems have to actually have power to make either of those things happen. So maybe while the Democrats still have the White House in their hands, they should consider all of this and make the right decision. We have a great show for you all today. We're going to be giving you all a history lesson in third-party candidates, and we're also going to break down how J.D. Vance really sees women, or at least women without children. But first, it's time for Trending Down. Welcome to Trending Down, a segment where we take a look at some of the more trivial topics floating around the internet this past week. And first up, artificial intelligence has been taking the world by storm since last year, flooding the internet with hyper-realistic, yet notably fake images where the people tend to look more attractive, but they always seem to have way too many fingers. Like, I don't know what's going on there. But one of the things that we've all been worried about is the possible effect that AI-generated images will have on the 2024 presidential election. Why, just last week, Donald Trump claimed Kamala Harris was faking her crowd size, accusing her of posting an AI-generated image that made it look like she had a huge crowd waiting for her near Air Force Two, when he claims that crowd didn't really exist. Now, the image in question was in fact real. Several cameras from different news organizations captured this large crowd from different angles that day. Just a week after Trump accused Kamala Harris of using fake pictures, Trump decided to reshare several pictures on his platform, Truth Social, now that's an oxymoron if there's ever been one, depicting Taylor Swift fans who now support Trump. This first photo looks pretty real. Someone definitely sprung for the paid version of their favorite AI generator. But these photos that Trump shared are indeed fake. I mean, did Trump not notice the word satire above this Swifties turning to Trump headline? Last week, I did a whole piece on these boomer bait fake news satire pages on places like Facebook and Twitter, and I guess Donald didn't get the memo. Now, first of all, Taylor Swift endorsed Biden when he was still in the race, and she's been heavily critical of Donald Trump since 2020, so I don't think she's telling any of her fans to vote for him. However, I'm sure there are plenty of Taylor Swift fans that support Trump. I'm also pretty sure that most of them have thumbs, unlike the fake women in these AI photos. This isn't the first time that fake pictures depicting Trump supporters have spread on social media. Earlier this year, these fake photos tried to make it look like Trump was hanging out with some black folks. You know, if Trump wanted to get more of the black vote, he could have just took a picture with actual, real black people instead of digital ones. But giving him the benefit of the doubt, Trump and his campaign didn't actually make these fake images, but many groups that support him are spreading these things online. And it can be really hard to tell if they're fake, especially if you're not familiar with how AI photos work. So here are a few quick tips. Always zoom into the background on these photos and look at the people. Many of them will have distorted faces. AI also doesn't handle text well. So if you see some words in the image on a shirt or a building that look kind of off, that's a sign it might be AI. And you could also just do a reverse image search on Google that will reveal where these photos actually came from. And if all else fails, count those fingers. But seriously, Trump, accusing Harris of sharing fake photos only to then share fake photos yourself, that's not very demure of you. Not very mindful. Did I pronounce it right? Is it demure or demure? How do you fucking pronounce it? I don't fucking know. Former environmental lawyer Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as of the making of this video, is still running for President of the United States, and he is the most prominent third-party candidate in the 2024 election. He's currently polling around 5% nationally, but reports are now saying that Kennedy has reached out to both the Trump and Harris camps in order to secure some type of cabinet position with these individuals in exchange for dropping out of the race. Now, why would he reach out to both? Probably because experts are still debating with one another about whether or not Kennedy pulls more votes from the Democrats or from the Republicans, as he is most known for his controversial opinions regarding vaccines. But Kennedy's campaign is starting to run out of money, and he is starting to see just how difficult it is to be a third-party candidate for president. Now, for anyone who is thinking of voting for RFK Jr., I wanted to give you a quick little history lesson on third-party candidates in the United States. The American political system has pretty much always had two major political parties, especially when it comes to the presidency. Now, they weren't always the same parties. Originally, it was the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. At one point in time, we had the Democrats versus the Whigs. But since the 1850s, it has been the Republicans and the Democrats. And a third-party candidate has never won a presidential election. In fact, only one third-party candidate even came remotely close to winning, and he was a former president himself, Theodore Roosevelt, in 1912. But third-party candidates usually end up being one thing and one thing only, and that's spoilers. We've seen 3 presidential elections in which the third-party vote exceeded the president's margin of victory, meaning in those elections, if the third-party candidate wasn't running, the victory probably would have went in the other direction. These elections include 1844, the year 2000, and 2016. In 1844, James G. Birney ran as a third-party candidate for the anti-slavery Liberty Party, and he won about 2.3% of the vote. He won crucial votes in swing states like New York that helped determine the election, and as a result, he helped contribute to Democrat James K. Polk winning the election, who beat his opponent, Henry Clay, by fewer than 40,000 votes, a margin of just 1.4%. James K. Polk was an avid slave supporter and a slave owner himself, and he would lead America into the Mexican War in order to annex Texas during his time in office. Of course, we all know what effect Green Party candidate Ralph Nader had on the super close election of 2000, and in 2016, it was the Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson who probably led to Trump victories in places like Ohio and Florida. In both of those last 2 cases, the person who won the popular vote ended up losing the Electoral College vote and the election itself. There have only been 5 elections in American history in which the third-party candidate has even won actual states. In 1892, populist candidate James B. Weaver won 5 states, mostly west of the Mississippi. In 1912, former President Theodore Roosevelt ran as the Progressive Bull Moose Party candidate, and he is the only third-party candidate to come in second place, winning more states in that election than one of the major party candidates. However, he did split the Republican vote with the incumbent President William Howard Taft, which led to a Woodrow Wilson victory. 1924 saw progressive Robert M. Lowe Folliet winning his home state of Wisconsin, and of course, in the elections of 1948 and 1968, it was white supremacy and racism that fueled the third-party candidates. Strom Thurmond won 4 southern states running as a Dixiecrat in 48, and Alabama Governor George Wallace, the most recent third-party candidate to win a state, won 5 southern states in 1968 by vowing to fight against civil rights for Black Americans. Not a huge selling point outside the South. 1992 was actually the last time a third-party candidate won over 5% of the vote. That was Ross Perot, and he actually won more than 18% of the vote. One could argue he was somewhat of a major spoiler for President George H.W. Bush. So what's the lesson here? Well, third-party candidates usually just don't have the popularity to actually win presidential elections, but they can have a major effect on the outcome of an election. In almost every scenario given here, If the third party candidate wasn't involved, the major party candidate who lost the presidential election would have probably won. Now, I'm not necessarily telling you not to vote for third party candidates. Personally, I'm very fed up with the two-party system, and I would love to see a true independent candidate that could actually win, someone who was proposing intelligent solutions to complex problems. But I don't really think RFK Jr. is that person, and I think his legacy will be consistent with every other third party candidate in US history, and that is someone who served as a spoiler. The question still remains, who will he spoil the most? When Donald Trump and the Republicans chose author-turned-Senator J.D. Vance to be the vice presidential nominee for their ticket, they probably hoped that when conservatives watched him give speeches on TV, they would admire him from the couches of their homes. Not that J.D. Vance himself would just be admiring the couches these people were sitting on. I'm sorry, I had to get that out of my system. That's just a debunked myth, guys. J.D. Vance did not write about doing couches in his memoirs. However, Vance himself did crack a joke about this rumor at a recent rally, and it's like, bro, read the room. That is not the kind of publicity you want or need right now. But there's something far more problematic and far more sinister about J.D. Vance, beyond his possible furniture fetish. One of the most troubling things about Vance is the pure hatred and vitriol that he shows for American women who do not have children. By now, you've probably heard that J.D. Vance once referred to Kamala Harris and other Democratic women as childless cat ladies, a very unoriginal term that Vance uses to refer to any woman over 30 who does not have children yet. The exact quote Vance gave Tucker Carlson back in 2021 went as followed. "We're effectively running this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and at the choices they've made. And so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too." Okay, wow, that statement alone was filled with more irony than any scenario given in that Alanis Morissette song. Seriously, Vance, you want to talk about corporate oligarchs after you were Peter Thiel's lapdog for so many years? And you want to bring up people who are so miserable that all they want to do is make the rest of the country miserable too? Because that literally describes 90% of the far-right nuts who argue with people on Facebook all day, insulting everyone who disagrees with them just so they can stick it to the libs because they can't stick it to their ex-wives anymore. But of course, the most insulting thing Vance said there was the idea that these extremely successful women who are achieving goals that would have been impossible for them 60 or 70 years ago are somehow miserable just because they don't have kids. Essentially, pushing the very sexist notion that a woman's only value is her ability to give birth. In that same interview with Carlson, Vance went on to say, quote, "You look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children. And how does it make any sense that we've turned our country over to people who don't really have a direct stake in it?" Interesting. J.D. Vance thinks that you shouldn't have a say-so in America's future if you don't have biological children, because that means you don't have a direct stake in what happens to this country. Well, what about George Washington? Maybe you've heard of him. First US president, commander of the Continental Army, one of the main fucking founding fathers of this country. George Washington was not a father himself. He never had any natural-born children. In fact, he was sterile, a condition he suffered from a bout of smallpox he contracted early in life. George Washington's wife Martha had kids from a previous marriage, and by all accounts, George was a great stepdad to those kids and a great grandfather to some of their kids. But George Washington didn't have any real kids of his own by J.D. Vance's standards. So I guess we should just throw out everything Washington ever said or did, because he didn't have a real direct stake in this country's future. Andrew Jackson also didn't have any natural children. His wife died before they could have kids. And isn't Andrew Jackson one of the heroes of the far right these days? Isn't Trump basically trying to recreate Andrew Jackson's Trail of Tears, just with undocumented immigrants this time? It certainly seems that way. But of course, Washington and Jackson were men. And nobody ever goes up to a 40-year-old man and say, "Hey, when are you going to settle down and have some kids?" But when a woman is even pushing 28 and doesn't have children, traditional ideologues like Vance look at them as a problem. And what about women who can't even have children naturally? People like Vance keep trying to blame the Democrats and liberals for why Americans aren't having more children. But really, there are a lot of women who want to have kids but can't because of rising infertility rates. Why aren't we doing more scientific research to figure out what's going on there? And then think about the economic issues related to having a child these days. See, I actually have a kid. I have a direct stake in this country, according to J.D. Vance. And one of the first things I remember after the surreal experience of seeing a small human exit my wife was the $3,000 bill we got from the hospital that day. And that was with insurance. And that was also with a simple, problem-free birth. Imagine the bill for those who have complications. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The price for formula and diapers have skyrocketed in recent years. The average cost of daycare in America is about $400 a week. A lot of money if you're living in the poor areas of Appalachia that Vance is so desperately trying to appeal to. But of course, Vance would just say, you don't need daycare. The mom should stay at home with the kids. Be a single income family. Yeah. Try making that work in those poor areas that have so little opportunity. And if you can manage to secure some great high-paying professional job, that job will usually discourage you from even having kids, because having kids will cut into your work time. You know how many women get fired and demoted every year in this country just because they got pregnant? And a lot of these women have to work because they have to support themselves, and they don't want to be forced to rely on men like you, J.D. Vance, to take care of them. The reality is, having a child doesn't inherently make you a better person, and it certainly doesn't give you a greater stake in the future of this country. That's like saying you should only care about what happens to future Americans if those Americans came directly from your sperm. That's fucking weird. Like, J.D. Vance is fucking weird. Stop being so fucking weird, bro, and leave those couches at IKEA alone. I want to thank you all for watching another episode of History Now the Future. On this week's Thursday interview episode, I talked to a good friend of mine's, TJ Whitehead. Now, he's actually known on TikTok as Power is Taken, Not Given. He makes a lot of cool content about history and politics, but he's actually also a veteran of the United States Army. And we talked about a lot of veteran issues, including what he had to say about what Donald Trump said about the Medal of Honor.
My overall reaction when I heard that was, oh yeah, that sounds like something Donald Trump would say. I gotta look at it the way Donald Trump looks at the world, because Donald Trump looks at the world in his weird, perverse standard of beauty. And so, all right, here's your Medal of Honor, but you can't walk. What good does it do you? That's how Donald Trump is thinking.
Be sure to check out that episode Thursday. And I also wanted to remind you guys that the podcast will now be coming out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So Tuesdays will be the monologue episode and Thursdays will be the interview episode. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to this YouTube page so you never miss an episode. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you guys next time.